Hello, I'm Michael Parker, and welcome to Antidote. What do Al Pacino, Muhammad Ali, Bob Dylan, and Dick Cheney have in common? They are part of what today's guest calls the war babies, the generation that changed America. And our guest today is Professor Richard Pells. He is a Professor of History Emeritus at the University of Texas. This is his fifth book, and I'm reading it right now. It's very entertaining. Professor Pells, welcome to Antidote.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
And you are in Austin, Texas, correct?
In hot Austin, Texas.
Hot
yes.
Austin, Texas. Well, I'm reading your book right now. It's very entertaining, and you make some very interesting notes about generations. I think, obviously, when people talk about generations, the people who always grab the big headlines are the baby boomers and the greatest generation. But you pick out this group that you call war babies. Tell us who they are and what the distinction is.
Well, first of all, I'll tell you how I got the idea. I went to my 50th high school reunion in 2009 in Kansas City, Missouri, where I was born and raised. And I was born in 1941. All the people in the room were born in 1940 or 1941. And I realized that nobody had written about any of us as a distinctive generation. And so that's how I got the idea for the book. I went home and began looking up people that I thought might be born, say, between 1939 and 1945, the years of World War II. And I was absolutely astonished by the number of famous and influential people in music, in movies, in sports, in journalism, and in politics who were born during these years. And it's true, as you say, most of the discussion has been about what Tom Brokaw, who in fact is a war baby, he was born in 1940, but what he called in a best-selling book, the greatest generation, the people who grew up during the Great Depression and fought World War II. And then we've heard all sorts of books and essays about the baby boomers who were born beginning after World War II and really stretching until the 1960s. But nobody wrote about what I call the war babies, and that's the genesis of the book. One of the things I discovered in terms of the kinds of people I focus on in the book, in the case of music, are composers, songwriter, performers like Bob Dylan and Joan Baez, Paul Simon and Art Garfunkel, Joni Mitchell, Janis Joplin, Judy Collins, Jimi Hendrix, Brian Wilson of the Beach Boys. In film, you have directors like Francis Ford Coppola, Martin Scorsese, George Lucas, as well as actors like Robert De Niro and Al Pacino. In journalism, in addition to Tom Brokaw, you have Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, George Will, Roger Ailes, who's not officially a journalist, but he was certainly important as the founder of Fox News in 1996. And then in politics, people like John Kerry, Nancy Pelosi, Barney Frank, Joe Biden, and as you mentioned, Dick Cheney. Whatever you think of Cheney, it's inarguable that he was the most powerful and influential vice president in American history. You also have athletes like Muhammad Ali and Billie Jean King, who transcended their sports to have a major impact on American life.
It is an extraordinary list of people. Last night, I started making a list of all the people that you mentioned, and it just goes on, and it's this small slice of time, as you mentioned, from 1939 to 1945, and it is the shadow that they cast over popular culture, and as you mentioned, the value system that we have inherited from them, it's just astounding.
Yeah, well, for example, if we just take the music for a moment, almost all the music that we associate with the 1960s and 1970s was in fact composed and performed by war babies, including across the Atlantic, the Beatles and the Rolling Stones, all of whom were born around 1941, 42, 43. The audience for that music were the baby boomers, the people, for example, who showed up at Woodstock in 1969, but the performers were war babies. And again, as you say, one of the things that struck me was how great an impact these people in music and movies and other fields had on our national life and culture over the past 50 or 60 years.
Well, some of the things that you lay out early in the book, I want to address because you talk about the effects that these people have, and you mentioned the value system. One of the things that really struck me, and I cannot shake because it's such an interesting idea, you say that war babies' perspective on America was darker and more pessimistic than their predecessors or their successors. I find that very interesting.
I don't know about them, their successors, but certainly them, their predecessors. You know, if you think of the people who grew up and experienced the Great Depression and then World War II, these were people who thought of the government as a benevolent institution, an institution that was addressing and solving their problems. These were people, many of whom are parents, who worshiped Franklin Roosevelt. I remember the day in 1945 when Roosevelt died. I was walking with my mother in a street in Kansas City. A barber came out of the barber shop, whispered something in my mother's ear, and she immediately burst into tears. And then told me why she was crying, that the president, Roosevelt, had died. I'm sure that as a young child, I didn't know the impact that Roosevelt had had, except as I saw his death shaking my mother, in much the same way that in the 1960s, for very different reasons, we all were shaken by the assassinations of John F. Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, and Martin Luther King. But those were assassinations, not natural deaths. And I think one of the things that happened during the years of the Cold War, McCarthyism, the Civil Rights Movement, and then Vietnam and Watergate, is that those of us who were growing up and reaching maturity during these years became much more pessimistic, much more skeptical about centralized power, about the role of the government, about the honesty of the government. You know, by the Vietnam War, people were talking about the credibility gap in the Johnson administration. That was a nice euphemism for the sense that the government was lying about the progress of the war. And then, of course, all of this blossomed during Watergate, which was really an extensive series of criminal acts undertaken by the presidency, by the White House. And that kind of experience, which the war babies not only went through, but chronicled in their journalism, in their music, and in their movies, really did have a transforming effect on America.
Well, yes, that makes sense. And the fact that their parents had survived the Depression, and you tell us in the book, and it certainly would inform their personality, that they didn't take things for granted. They aspired to work hard, and which is not to say that the baby boomers didn't feel some of those same threads, but this particular group of people over the 6-year period, it was imprinted upon them in an indelible way.
Yes, well, you have to remember that, you know, these people were young children for the most part during World War II, but then they were adolescents during the worst years of the Cold War and during the tensest episodes in American political life during the McCarthy era. Again, I remember my mother I was, I think, in the sixth grade or something in 1954. My mother used to let me stay home from school and in order to watch on television the Army McCarthy hearings, presumably on the notion that I would learn more from those than I did from anything I might learn in class. I think she was right. Carl Bernstein, as a young boy, was the child of parents who had been members of the American Communist Party in the 1940s and were active in the labor movement. And in the 50s, they were constantly tailed by FBI agents, including two agents that showed up for Bernstein's bar mitzvah. What would have been subversive about reading from the Torah was unclear, but certainly that shaped Bernstein's childhood and adolescence, and it fed into his skepticism about governmental power, which became obvious in his work with Carl Woodward for the Washington Post during the Watergate crisis in the early 70s.
Understood. Well, let's back up a little bit and talk. One of the other things that struck me is you mentioned that many of these people who would go on to be luminaries in the artistic world, whether they were filmmakers or musicians or actors, many of them were the children of immigrants. Several of them had polio. Many of them had parents who were either professional or amateur musicians, and many of them were Jewish. And it's very interesting how that all cut across so many of these people.
Yes, Jewish and Italian.
Yes, Jewish and Italian, yes.
You mentioned polio. Polio is the most dread disease of the first half of the 20th century, until the discovery in 1955 of the Salk vaccine, and in 1957, the Sabin vaccine. But a number of these people had polio as children. Joni Mitchell, Judy Collins, Francis Ford Coppola, all of them recovered. But it was a terrifying disease because nobody knew what caused it. And that added to the general sense of dread and fear in the 1940s and 50s that was crystallized really in the Cold War. Bob Dylan, Dylan was not his real name. His real name was Zimmerman, and he was the child of Jewish parents growing up in Minnesota in the 1950s. Then he changed his name to Dylan, and that's what he became famous for. The Italian experience is equally important. Francis Ford Coppola came from an Italian immigrant family, and in The Godfather, Part 1 and Part 2, released in 1972 and 1974, Coppola was really telling the story not just of the mafia, but of the Italian immigrant experience and what it did to the Italian family as they adapted to America in the first half of the 20th century. Martin Scorsese, who also grew up in an Italian family, made movies from Mean Streets and Taxi Driver on that portrayed his own sense of Italian heritage, and particularly the sense that the two major institutions of Italian immigrant life were the church and the mob, and religion and crime really coalesce in Scorsese's films as they do in Coppola's films. Al Pacino also grew up in an Italian immigrant family. At the age of 2, his parents divorced. They were living in New York, and his mother took him to live with her parents, who were immigrants from, if you're ready for this, Corleone, Sicily.
Amazing.
And the fact that Pacino's heritage were people from Corleone fed in, obviously, to his own portrayal of Michael Corleone in The Godfather Part 1 and Part 2. Another
thing that struck me, and listen, I'm I love the art and the culture of the 60s and 70s. All of my favorite artists pretty much came from that period. One of the things you discuss, which to me also kind of is linked to this pessimism and this feeling of foreboding that and this burden that they felt, is also how many of these artists had a social conscience that was expressed in their work.
Yes, to some extent, although it seems to me what was even stronger and a way of dealing with their general sense of pessimism was an emphasis on introspection, on their own personal identity as it translated into their work. Before the 1960s, the great singers in American popular culture were people like Frank Sinatra, Ella Fitzgerald, who really performed other people's music. The music of George Gershwin, Irving Berlin, Rodgers and Hart, Cole Porter. But what changed in the 1960s with people like Bob Dylan and Paul Simon, the Beatles, was that they were creating their own music. They were composing their own music, and then they managed to make that music identifiable to a mass audience. That's a real trick. And it's one of the things they were masterful at. The same thing is true in terms of filmmakers. People like Coppola, Scorsese, George Lucas wanted to make personal films, not just assembly line products from Hollywood. And because of the transformation in the movie industry in the late 60s and early 70s, they were able to do that. We all think of George Lucas as the director of Star Wars, but before he made Star Wars, he made a wonderful movie called American Graffiti, which is filled with music from the late 50s and 1960s, but it's really a semi-autobiographical movie about his own experience growing up in Modesto, California, in the 50s and early 60s. And so Scorsese, Coppola, they were all making movies that were based on their own personal experience as a way of coping with what was going on in the country.
Understood. One of the other things that you mentioned is that they turned, because you mentioned their introspectiveness, they also kind of moved away from the conformity of previous generations, and they wanted to, as you just mentioned in some of they wanted to be more personal with their art. They wanted to stand out, which certainly was a component of the 60s. I mean, you look at the pop art that emerged from the 60s, it was outrageous, it was interesting. You look at a guy like Jimi Hendrix. I mean, you couldn't be much more of an individual than that, a person like Lou Reed. It's why did they turn away from the conformity of the previous generations?
Well, what's interesting is that in the 1930s, during the Great Depression and during World War II, many of their parents believed in the ideal of community, of collective action, of the notion that you couldn't solve your problems alone, that you had to join with others in institutions like unions in order to deal with the problems of the Depression, and certainly to join together to win the war against Nazism in Japan. That ideal of community becomes, in some ways, the fear of conformity by the 1950s. You certainly see it in the movies of that era. And that, in turn, explodes in the 1960s, where people believe that the only way they can transform the society is by means of their own personal commitment, their own private identity, their own search for individual freedom and individual liberation. And that really runs through a lot of the demonstrations, a lot of the anti-war movement, certainly, of the late 60s and 1970s. And that emphasis on personality, combined with the skepticism about government, is something that I think the country still believes deeply in today.
I would agree with that. One of the other things that crosses my mind a great deal, and when I talk to people, I'm here in Hollywood. I am the myth maker for the civilization. And when we talk about pop culture and what you're describing, it also, occurs to me that these people who were rising up within journalism, within film, within art, within sports, this was also the time when the infrastructure for all of these forms was growing at a breakneck speed. And I've had people say to me before, and I tend to agree with this, there will never be another Beatles because the way that we put music out and what's focused upon these days it's just never going to have that effect again. I could be wrong, but I do not anticipate that happening. And then when you look at journalism and you talk about these people that you talk about and how important the newspaper was, and obviously we know what's happening to newspapers now. So what you're describing with these people and this sweet pot of time, the sweet spot in time that they lived in, I think also coalesced into their rise to just making great art and great information at a perfect time.
Yeah, and they also took advantage of the technology available to them.
Yes.
If you think of people like the Beatles or like the Beach Boys, you couldn't make Sgt. Pepper in 1957. The technology wasn't available for that, but you could make it in 1967 because the recording industry was undergoing enough technological transformations to make multi-track recordings and other inventions possible. In the case of the movie industry, really until the 1960s, Hollywood was not simply a state of mind, it was a real place where studios existed and controlled every aspect of filmmaking. All of that collapsed in the 1960s, and that made it possible for a new generation of filmmakers like Lucas, like Scorsese, like Coppola, to make very different kinds of movies than anybody would have anticipated 10 or 20 years earlier. People like Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, as investigative reporters, were given the freedom by, in this case, the Washington Post, to really indulge in a multi-year investigation of the crimes of the Nixon administration. And newspapers, along with network television, were really the most important forms of communicating the news. I can remember, John Dean's televised testimony before the Senate Watergate Committee, which was absolutely riveting. All he did was sit there and read for a day and a half his diary of what had happened during the Nixon administration. All that changes by today, but one of the people, and I mentioned him earlier, who was instrumental in that change was Roger Ailes, because by creating Fox News in 1996, he transformed cable news networks and made network television much less influential today than it had been, say, 30 years earlier.
I'm glad you made that mention of Roger Ailes and Fox News, because one of the people that you mentioned in the book, that you mentioned several politicians, and many of them are Democrats, Nancy Pelosi, Barney Frank, John Kerry, but the kind of dark horse in here is Dick Cheney, who was born to Democratic parents, but became the most powerful vice president of all time. And the reason I bring this up is because you talk about how the war babies kind of fostered this sense of values that is carried over until now. And I would argue that over the past 15 years, there has been a major neoconservative influence that has operated within the political landscape. And certainly he was one of the primary people behind that. Talk about Dick Cheney for a moment.
Yeah, and not just Dick Cheney, but also people like George Will.
Certainly. Became
an extraordinarily influential pundit on television, as well as in newspapers and magazines from the 1970s on. Cheney, as you say, began or at least his family, were Democrats. He grew up in the West, in Nebraska, I believe, and then moved to Wyoming. But he himself, from a very early age, was a conservative, and he got his start early on. People forget this, but in the mid-'70s, he was the chief of staff to Gerald Ford.
That's right.
And one of his mentors was not only Ford, but Donald Rumsfeld.
Yes.
And then after Ford was defeated in 1976, he went back to Wyoming and ran for Congress eventually and was elected. Wyoming has only one congressman. He was it. And he became one of the most important and powerful Republican congressmen during the Reagan years. In the early 90s, under George Herbert Walker Bush, he was Secretary of Defense before he became Vice President in 2001. So Cheney's had a long career in the conservative ranks, and he's played as important a role in American politics as any of his Democratic opponents. Roger Ailes started out in the late 60s as a media advisor to Richard Nixon. His job was to make Nixon on television more pleasant and more likable. I don't think that turned out so well. But Ailes went on to advise other Republican politicians, including George Herbert Walker Bush. Before he created Fox News, he created CNBC in 1993, which transformed business reporting on television. So he's had an incredibly innovative impact on American politics.
Well, I think that your point that you make in this book is well taken. It is an extraordinary group of people. I mean, we didn't even get to touch on so many of the people that are the civil rights movement. You had John Lewis, you had Jesse Jackson. There was just so many people within the actors. You've got Christopher Walken, Faye Dunaway, Michael Cimino, the filmmaker behind The Deer Hunter, and political activists. You have Tom Hayden, Mario Savo. It's just a really amazing group of people. So, Professor Pells, I thank you for joining us today. I urge everyone to go out and take a look at the book. It's really entertaining, and it's a quite insightful look at a group of people and kind of a mini generation that oftentimes does not really get looked at with the scrutiny that it should.
Well, thank you very much for having me. For those of you who might be interested in the book, it's easily available on Amazon as well as barnesandnoble.com. This is my little plug for the book. But in any case, I love talking about it. I love talking about the whole experience, and I'm glad to have the opportunity to do so.
Well, we certainly appreciate you coming on. And one of the things I enjoy about your work also, as a historian, your expertise lies in 20th century history. And I would argue that the 20th century and the last half of the 20th century is possibly the most influential period of time that's affecting us at the moment.
Well, I think so too. Some people wouldn't necessarily consider that history, but I do, mostly because I lived through it. So I'm talking about my own past as well.
Professor Pells, thank you so much. Ladies and gentlemen, the book is War Babies, The Generation That Changed America. It's a great read. I hope you'll check it out.